Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York, which envisions a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today on an update for justice for Ukraine, featuring David Crane. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our guest. You do not need to save up your questions until the end. So as our conversation prompts thoughts and ideas, please put those in the Q&A section, and I will do my best to sprinkle those in as we go. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be on the center's YouTube channel as soon as possible. So now to today's expert guest. David M. Crane was the founding chief prosecutor of the International War Crimes Tribunal in West Africa, called the United Nations Special Court for Sierra Leone. The world's first hybrid international war crimes tribunal, the Special Court for Sierra Leone successfully prosecuted those who bore the greatest responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity, to include the first African sitting head of state in history, President Charles Taylor. David published a book on his experience there called Every Living Thing, the first time an international chief prosecutor has written about his daily experiences seeking justice for victims of atrocity. Dr. Crane served 30 years in the U.S. federal government prior to his selection by Kofi Annan to be the chief prosecutor of the Special Court, the first American since Justice Robert H. Jackson at Nuremberg. A member of the Senior Executive Service of the United States, he retired from federal service as the director of the Office of Intelligence Review in the Department of Defense, where he oversaw, on behalf of the Secretary of Defense and the intelligence committees of the U.S. Congress, 80% of the U.S. intelligence community organizations. Since leaving West Africa, Dr. Crane has been a leading force in seeking justice for the people of Syria through the Syrian Accountability Project, and assisting in the creation of the International, Impartial, and Independent Mechanism for the Republic of Syria. The Syrian Accountability Project is part of the Global Accountability Network, which Dr. Crane founded, that also houses the Yemeni Accountability Project and the Venezuelan Accountability Project, as well as the Uyghur and Ukrainian Accountability Projects. Dr. Crane is assisting the international community in the creation of a special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression, and one of the reasons we have asked him to be with us today. For these efforts, President Vladimir Putin has placed sanctions on him and banned him from travel to the Russian Federation. He is one of 25 persons that Putin has personally sanctioned as an enemy of the state. In 2014, Dr. Crane was the co-author of the world-famous Caesar Report, which captured for the first time, direct evidence of crimes against humanity being committed by President Assad of Syria against his own citizens. Dr. Crane is a veteran, having served his country as an officer in the 101st Airborne Division during the Vietnam era and the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as a special operations officer in the United States Army. He recently retired as a professor at Syracuse University College of Law, where he founded Impunity Watch. Dr. Crane currently is a distinguished scholar in residence at Syracuse University and an adjunct professor with the Washington College of Law at American University, where he teaches international criminal practice. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
I appreciate you taking the time periodically to give us these updates. The last time we spoke with you was in April of this year, April of 2023, which was about 14 months into the war at that point. And shortly before that, the International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim A.A. Khan had issued arrest warrants for President Vladimir Putin and one of his cabinet ministers, which alleged that they had committed the war crimes of unlawful deportation of children and that of unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas of the Ukraine into the Russian Federation. Thought it would be helpful for us to start with some refreshers and some context setting. So that's why I laid that out. But I am curious, and I think our audience is curious as well, has there been any particular movement on that, since that is the first of the arrest warrants to have been issued?
Well, again, it's just great to be here with you all this afternoon, or maybe this evening, depending on where you're from. And again, my compliments to the Robert H. Jackson Center, as well as you, Kristen, for your leadership in holding these very important updates on so many interesting areas of the law. And so I'm really pleased to be a part of that, a small part of that. But it's interesting. We're moving forward with justice for the people of Ukraine. Our good friends and colleagues at the International Criminal Court continue to investigate a whole bunch of allegations and violations of international criminal law, from war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even incitement to genocide, and perhaps genocide, of which they have particular jurisdiction over. The arrest warrant is issued. It's out there. It has boxed President Putin into a corner. He cannot travel to member states of the International Criminal Court because they have an obligation to arrest him. So right now, investigations are continuing from the ICC, and they'll be building a very good case against Vladimir Putin and his political and military leadership related to the violations of international crimes, which there are so many of related to that tragic day in February of 2022.
Well, and so over this year, Ukraine has held multiple talks, I believe 3 so far, about its 10-point peace plan. And obviously, one of the points is accountability for what has happened in there. And so let's turn to some of the accountability options for the crimes that are being alleged in Ukraine. When we had spoken in the spring, the thought was that there would be a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, and possibly the ICC would move forward with war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity. Is that still the current thinking?
Well, again, the world is focused, though it's beginning to become slightly distracted, but the world is focused on holding Vladimir Putin and his henchmen accountable for multiple violations of international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, but also aggression. Now, the International Criminal Court has unique jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but they do not have jurisdiction because of a procedural quirk that's not to be worried about right now. But we don't have, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And so very early on in the summer of 2022, we put together a high-level working group and began to develop an international modality of holding him accountable. Now, there are various options out there that's being thrown around by the international community. There is a hybrid option, kind of a domestic-based option in Ukraine. There's a second option, which is a regional option, kind of focused, more European-centric. Now, these two options have a major problem, and that is head of state immunity. And that will preclude those two options from actually going after the very person that perpetrated the aggression against the people of Ukraine, and that is President Vladimir Putin. And so those are really not realistic options, but surprisingly, we have several key countries that are kind of pushing this and backing it, to include the United States, I believe Germany and France and the United Kingdom. And that's a huge problem because, again, it turns the whole process into really just an unworkable set of solutions, and really not one that could actually hold the person who committed the aggression against Ukraine, and that is Vladimir Putin. Now, we have two other options because, again, when I was chief prosecutor in West Africa, prosecutor me versus Charles Taylor, we indicted President Charles Taylor for international crimes, and our appellate division held that, and this is really kind of almost a Marbury versus Madison decision as far as international criminal law is concerned, and that is that a sitting head of state is not immune from violations of international crimes while a head of state. That's a huge decision that has now stood as the cornerstone by which we now hold sitting heads of state accountable for atrocity crimes. And so I think that that was very important. Well, then there are two other international options. And of course, I'm very much involved in both of those options. The first one is a United Nations General Assembly backed special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression. And the other option, which has been laid out, because right now the UN General Assembly is kind of at an all stop related to this, and so nothing is happening related to this. And to get things going, because we really have to move forward on holding Putin accountable for the aggression, is an idea that I came up with Ambassador David Sheffer over breakfast at the Cosmos Club about a month ago. And we said, another way we could do this is create what we call a multinational court for Ukraine on the crime of aggression. And what that would be is very similar to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the International Military Tribunal at Tokyo, where a group of states, to include member states of the United Nations now, a core group, would come together and create a charter that would create this multinational court put together by various nations from both the global north and the global south. And so this is also a very viable option related to holding Vladimir Putin and his senior political and military leaders accountable. So that's where we are related to the justice mechanisms that were being discussed. Currently, as I speak, really nothing is really being done at this point. But again, we're pushing, and this working group that I'm a part of is pushing very hard. In fact, yesterday I just issued an open letter to the international community calling on them to, if they don't want to do something about a UN General Assembly-backed special tribunal, that they consider a multinational court. But regardless of what they choose, we've got to get going because time is of the essence. And that is out publicly, and I will make sure that you get a copy of that, Kristen, so you can post it on your website as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Is the thinking that the multinational court will be able to move forward with greater speed than working through the United Nations process?
Yes, again, when really at the end of the day, the bright red thread, and probably some of you or many of you have heard me say this before, the bright red thread of modern international criminal law is politics. We have the legal basis and the experience to create a tribunal. We've done this before. I've done this before, but it's a political decision to create a tribunal, not a legal one. And so right now, the UN General Assembly-backed approach is really at an all-stop related just to the political aspects of that. So, but because nothing is really being done at this point related to really creating an international tribunal or court to hold him accountable, we have to come up with various other options. And so what the multinational court does is strips away all the political baggage related to a UN system-created tribunal and allows member states of the UN to outside to create this tribunal using the model of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, for example, where Robert H. Jackson was one of the lead prosecutors there. So we are going back to the future, so to speak, and related to seeking justice for the people of Ukraine. The problem is, and I think I need to address this now, and I think you need to really understand this. Time and distraction are Vladimir Putin's ultimate weapons. He knows us better than we, I think, know ourselves. He's playing the long game. He is going to hang on by the skin of his teeth, which he really is doing. He's lost militarily. And he's just going to wait out and see how the political landscape changes over time. Plus, he also knows that democracies, particularly European democracies, are very fickle and easily distracted. And, the tragedy that happened at the beginning of October of this past month related to the Hamas attack on Israel was a distraction. And the world has already stepped away. I was very much involved in seeking justice for the people of Syria for many, many years. And who talks about Syria anymore? Who talks about accountability for the loss of over 500,000 human beings? Time and distraction. And so what my real concern is on a day-to-day basis that I worry about most is we're losing a historical opportunity to hold a sitting head of state who threw out the UN paradigm and the UN charter and decide to invade a fellow member state of the UN in an aggressive act. Very similar to the very attitude that Adolf Hitler did when he was moving about in the late 1930s in Europe. And there was a lot of appeasement going on and, peace in our time with Chamberlain, all of those historical things that we've seen. But we're kind of at a moment where future generations will condemn us for not doing something about this aggression. If we do not, then the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century will fundamentally change. Because again, the question is, then why have a United Nations? Because the United Nations was really set up to prevent the very thing that happened by a sitting member, a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a founding country of the United Nations, throwing the whole thing out and invading a fellow member state, and that was Ukraine. So I'm very concerned about this. Time and distraction are Putin's ultimate weapons.
Well, and you and I have talked before as well about the international community's general preference to not have a trial in absentia. Do either of the special tribunal or the multinational court contemplate having a having the trial with Putin sitting there, or what does that look like?
That's a great question. And no, we don't contemplate trials in absentia, and they shouldn't. Being in the dock, being confronted with his discretion or his past indiscretions. But really the point in holding Vladimir Putin accountable for aggression is not the fact that he's actually sitting in one of these tribunal or court or the ICC. It's the fact that we indicted him. Now, the ICC stepped forward and issued that arrest warrant, and it's the beginning of an indictment process of which he will be indicted for many violations of international law. But we have to do something about the aggression. So the very fact that we put an international aggression tribunal or court together and go all the way forward to an actual issuance of an appropriate indictment is a win. Whether we get the individual, that may or may not be, but the point is that we have to indict him for the aggression. Because again, there are a whole bunch of other strongmen in the age of the strongman that we find are nationalistic dictators, tyrants, and thugs who are just watching like crocodiles, seeing what the world's democracies do about an aggressive act. And it'll be a dark world if we choose not to do something. So we don't actually have to have Putin sitting in the dock. No, it's important to remember this tribunal or court that I'm talking about, are going to be going after others as well, his senior political and military personages themselves. So it's not just Putin. Another thing, and I think the audience will find this interesting. Aiding and abetting aggression has never been pushed, but it is a valid and viable. We have countries, we have sitting heads of state who are aiding and abetting Putin's aggression against Ukraine, all of which are member states of the UN as well. So we're looking at Belarus, North Korea, Iran, and even China has to be careful. But potentially this tribunal or court, should we choose to go this path, would have the jurisdiction of investigating and seeing if there's a viable case against these other heads of state. Again, the point is democracy is faced with an authoritarian rise by individuals who do not follow the rule of law, and we've got to come at them and hit them right in the forehead with a hammer of law to let them know that you can't do this.
Well, and so there are a number of as you have mentioned, a number of countries and organizations that are contributing to these justice efforts. So, for example, the European Union Agency for Criminal Justice Cooperation stood up the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. I think I got that name right in July. It's a lot of words. And I know that Attorney General Merrick Garland has assigned a prosecutor, at least one prosecutor, to serve there. How are these organizations working together?
Well, I've met that in brief, that particular prosecutor, a wonderful a lady who has got a distinguished career. But that particular center in The Hague is really a clearinghouse and a coordination center for the dozen or so various investigations that are going on in the European Union, mainly related to the crime of aggression, both domestic and regional efforts to do something about that. And that's to be appreciated and lauded. But these are not justice mechanisms in the sense that we're contemplating actually holding Putin and his henchmen accountable for the crime of aggression. It is an effort to begin to coalesce some thinking related to the crime of aggression, but that's pretty much what it is. It's a step forward. In this business, a lot of times it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, but we're always leaning forward, and we always work towards getting things done as far as atrocity accountability. So that's what that is, and it's important, but it is not a solution.
We do have a question too, so about some of the mechanism within the court as well. So this question comes from Frank, and he's wondering if there is a mechanism for punishing perjury or contempt before an international crimes tribunal. I can understand the genesis of his question, but David, I confess I do not know the international law well enough to know if there is a mechanism for that.
Yeah, great question, Frank. Yes, of course there is. In our rules of evidence and procedure, again, anybody who gets on the stand and lies is committing perjury, and a witness can be held in a separate trial for that perjury, even though they weren't part of individuals who were indicted for international crimes. But any member of the court, any officer of the court who commits any type of unethical or criminal conduct can and will be held accountable for their discretion. So there is an opportunity to punish those kinds of things, unethical behavior or criminal behavior related to a trial itself. So that's a good question, Frank. Thank you.
You and I have talked in the past as well about how a lot of these special tribunals are self-funded, or at least they need to go out and seek the funding to support themselves. Has there been conversation around how either the special tribunal or the multinational court would sustain itself?
Yes, we've contemplated this. Again, it's important that we've done this before, almost a very similar situation in West Africa. And so what we did is I took my experiences there, and I developed 7 steps in the creation of these special tribunal or court related to the crime of aggression. And we talk about, I point in one of my steps is the financing of this. It would be voluntarily. It would not be part of the UN system, whether it be the special tribunal or if it's a multinational tribunal. Various member states would contribute not only money, but also equipment, personnel, vehicles, what have you. I remember back in the special court for Sierra Leone, China donated $300,000 worth of furniture. And so I went from sitting in a card table with folding chairs to a very nice desk and chair because China donated that. So there's a whole panoply of ways by which countries do and could, in this situation, support. But it would be contributions, monies overseen by what we would call, and we did this in West Africa, called a management committee, would manage to oversee the expenditure of funds and other associated type of monies or donations, what have you. Like in the special court for Sierra Leone was an ex officio member of the management committee, and it's contemplated in the 7 steps that we put together that Ukraine would be an ex officio member as well. In other words, we're not creating new anything. I think it's so important for our audience to understand we've done this before. We've done it successfully. We've taken down a sitting head of state. We have seen it done appropriately, fairly, openly, and that sitting head of state is now spending the rest of his life in a British prison in the United Kingdom for committing international crimes. So again, this is not rocket science. This is just function of having the world come together practically and politically to create an international tribunal or a multinational court so we can get the job going. And again, it's proven successful both historically as well as practically.
In terms of the multinational court, from a practical perspective, what is needed in order to stand that up? Is it some number of countries that agree that this is the path forward? And I'm assuming some sort of formal legal documents being signed, but what is the actual mechanism for standing that up?
Well, again, we actually have a core group of almost 40 nations who have come out publicly supporting an international mechanism to hold him accountable. So we already have that core group, that could come together, and they meet on a quarterly basis. They just met in Berlin, and they'll be meeting in January again. And hopefully this idea of a multinational court will be discussed and should be discussed. But that group could actually start the process. And there are members of not just the global north, but the global south as well. And of course, there would be an invitation. This group would hold a conference and invite any member state of the United Nations to come to this conference, where there would be a working group that would put together a charter. It would be reviewed, revised, and countries would be invited to sign that charter or not. That's the beauty of this multinational court. Countries can be directly involved or indirectly involved by just supporting the idea. They don't have to do anything, but again, just politically say they support that idea, but they don't have to do much more than that. And the key thing is as we build this and the charter is signed, it would go very similar to the package that we put together that President Zelensky signed off on back in September of 2022. It would be very similar as far as a statute that would be created, charter, you could call it. And then there would be rules of procedure and evidence created, and then we would just move forward. It would be very similar to the 7 steps related to the special tribunal. The nice thing is that it can happen tomorrow. It would just take a member of the core group to say, in January, let's have a conference on creating a multinational court for the crime of aggression. And it's tried, I think, but if you build it, they will come. And so countries that don't want to sign the charter would certainly probably send delegations and representatives to be a part of this. I would think that the G7 nations, I know that some of them do support a special tribunal, but they would come anyway. And I think it would build a momentum that would get the ball started. This time next year, if we have not done something about this at the international level, I don't think we'll be able to do it. I think we'll have missed the boat. So time is of the essence.
You did talk, we've talked a few times about sort of the clock ticking. What are some of the factors there? I know you're involved in the discussions. Do you see a likely path for the multinational court? Is that something you think really can move forward in the next year?
Well, I do. I really do, because it cuts away a lot of the procedural aspects of getting the UN General Assembly together and to pass a resolution, 2/3 of which would have to concur with recommending to the Secretary General that he enter into a bilateral agreement with Ukraine to create the special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression. The approach that I am certainly advocating takes it out of the procedural aspects of the General Assembly passing a resolution like this, 2/3. We have to have 2/3 of the world's countries to agree to this. And that's why even though it's a tremendous idea, and we have put the package together. I mean, we actually have the package, the sample copy of the resolution, a sample copy of the statute, a 7-step process to go from beginning all the way to an indictment of Vladimir Putin. That's all there, but we're at an all-stop related to the political aspects of this, and because the world is distracted with the tragedy that is the Israeli-Hamas conflict, and so people have moved away. And then, of course, politics injects into this. I mean, we can even see in our own country that people are now questioning, why are we sending all this money to Ukraine? And in fact, we're about to run out of money because of the lack of leadership by the House of Representatives. They're just not doing anything about this. And, legally, we're going to start running out of appropriations to actually send directly to Ukraine to continue this fight. And the United States is the cornerstone to this. I mean, all NATO nations are contributing, but the country that is really giving the cornerstone aid to Ukraine is the United States. And right now we're in a political corner. I mean, a corner that could really cause that kind of critical aid to go away. And so that's why Putin is doing the long game. Like I said, he's hanging on by his fingernails and just saying, hey, the U.S. is going to politically implode, and this is all going to go away. And then I'm going to ramp up my attacks on Ukraine. I'm certainly going to hold on to the East. Then I'm going to turn to Georgia and Moldova. And oh, by the way, maybe the Baltics look pretty good too. So all of a sudden, Ukraine is not, in Vladimir Putin's interesting mind, is only the first step, and that there are other nations that he would like to return back to the old Soviet Union. He's an old KGB colonel, and he's living in a dream world related to restoring some kind of union. This is he's been tested similar to what Adolf Hitler did back in the 30s. He tested, he poked, he prodded, and if he would have been stood up to, like in the Rhineland, who he invaded the Rhineland with 3 battalions against France's 40 divisions, and France caved. He took the Rhineland, and it was the beginning of a tragedy that ended up in World War II. So, again, these historical parallels are not perfect, but they are scary, aren't they?
Yep. We have a question from Jack, who says that Brazil's president just invited President Putin to the G20 summit. And Brazil is a country that I believe is under the treaty that should Putin travel, they would be obligated to arrest him. What are the options to arrest him? And what are the options if countries choose not to enforce those treaties?
Well, Lula, the president of Brazil, does this at his own political peril, in the sense that he's embarrassing Brazil. He's showing that, there's the rule of law, but then there is kind of the rule of law, and I'm willing to look the other way as far as having Putin come here. Again, this is very much like what I've been saying as far as distraction. We saw this in Syria. Assad was a monster. Our report, the Caesar report, showing that he on his own citizens, he was a He's back with the Arab League. He's now being rejoining the international community. And again, Putin's watching all this. Putin's a big backer of Assad in Syria. And so he's, again, this is that time and distraction thing. It's starting to unravel all, the global South, and this is our challenge as well, is, they don't have a dog in this fight, in their opinion. This is a European problem. And so this is why the multinational court approach takes away the UN imperator and encourages both the South and the North to join and be a part of this. So again, it's one of those situations where Lula does this at his own peril. It's a slap in the face, but it's an indication that things are starting to unravel and that the world is starting to turn around and walk away from Ukraine and move on. We saw it in Syria. I can see it happening. It's slipping through our fingers as we speak. And that's why I'm so much pushing all of this, is because time is of the essence. That if we don't do something by this time next year, we're done as far as any accountability related to the crime of aggression. Now, I do know that the International Criminal Court, the member states parties to the Rome Statute, are going to come together eventually and modify the procedure to allow future jurisdiction over the crime of aggression and related to non-state parties. But it ain't happening now. So what ends up happening is there is in fact, a very real possibility that Putin could get away with the crime of aggression now. So this is why time is so much of the essence, because of time and distraction. And Lula's inviting of Putin to Brazil is just not a big, but certainly an indicator that the world is starting to move on from this,
well,
in my opinion.
Just to recap for our audience members who may not have joined any of our earlier updates, one of the challenges with, please correct me if I say this wrong, one of the challenges with prosecuting the crime of aggression, especially with regard to the Russian Federation, is that they did not sign on to the amendment for that. So the ICC does not automatically have jurisdiction over them. And then similarly, although something can be referred by the UN Security Council, that has to be a unanimous referral to the ICC. And since the Russian Federation is a permanent member, they will veto that. And so that's those, in my recollection, those are the two challenges with the ICC moving forward with the crime of aggression against the Russian Federation. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did. For all intents and purposes, that's a perfect way, and it allows our audience to understand kind of that. I didn't want to go too far down that road because it gets a little bit more complicated, but I think that's a perfect summation of that. So yeah, well done, Kristen.
Thank you. I like to show that I pay attention during these conversations. We do. So you brought up something in your most recent answer about how people are viewing this potential justice mechanism. And we have a question from Rod about sort of the ICC writ large, and how it's often seen as an instrument of the West or an instrument of the developed world. Is there something the ICC can do to gain greater acceptance, or gain a wider acceptance in terms of how it's perceived by the global South and by less developed countries?
Well, yeah, again, the concept of an international criminal court is admirable, and one that most of the world's nations have signed up to, and it is to be lauded. It's had kind of a sketchy history, and it has caused it some political problems. And again, the bright red thread of not just creating tribunals, but also to successfully prosecute is you have to take in the political aspects of what one is doing. I'm not talking about politics with a big P, where people are influencing anything. I'm talking about politics with a small p, in the sense of where you understand your place in the world as a tribunal, what impact that tribunal, be it like in West Africa or Yugoslavia or Rwanda, or in general in the international community where you're operating, understanding the political context of what happens if I do some type of international prosecution. What is the political aspect of it? What is the diplomatic aspect of it? Even what is the cultural aspect of it related to what you're doing? And up until recently, the ICC's had kind of a tin ear on this. They've mainly focused on the law, which is important, but they don't have a record in politically being a part of the international community in a way that allows them to accomplish their mandate, but in a way that is respected and supported by particularly the global South. And as an aside, and I've said this before, really, and having been at the beginning of international criminal law, maybe one of its founders, yes, international criminal law is viewed from the global South. I've been there, particularly just trying to sell the idea of a special tribunal for Ukraine and the crime of aggression. But I was in the global South for many years in West Africa, trying to show former, it's a colonial issue. The world considers international criminal justice, particularly the global South, as almost white man justice, Western justice, European justice. And the track record of Europe in the global South is horrific for centuries, and they've been abusing and using the global South, and they haven't forgotten this. And so it's a real challenge, and that's some challenges related to Ukraine. Is, hey, that sounds like a European problem, and we're not that interested. But we have to be intellectually honest with ourselves that there is a bit of that perception that international criminal law is in some ways white man's justice. It's European. And so we have to be humble enough to try to figure out ways by which countries who are dealing with atrocities in the global South, how we factor in how they're thinking. In other words, and I use this is a term that I've coined, is the justice we seek, the justice they want. And the UN has a terrible track record of stepping over that and just coming in their white helicopters and their mandates and lots of money and just doing things without just asking the victims. And that's why I created that outreach program in Sierra Leone, is asking the victims, what do they think about all this? And so we were very successful in doing that. And because of it, it allowed us to successfully accomplish our mandate there. So all of this dust in the air, as we're talking about, and I think it's a great point, is that, yeah, there's an underlying anger and frustration and skepticism related to international justice. It's not the way we would want it, but it's the way it is. So in West Africa, as we faced it, confronted it, understood it, and stood in front of the people of Sierra Leone for hours upon hours, listening to them tell me what we should do and showing them the respect of listening to them and adjusting and modifying your prosecution plan where appropriate to their view.
There's something that happened in September. So the Ukraine and the Russian Federation participated in hearings before the International Court of Justice at The Hague over alleged violations of the Genocide Convention. So separate from what we've been talking about with the crime of aggression. And one of the things I found curious in that is that Ukraine was not arguing that genocide had occurred. They were arguing, and that's typically what happens under the Genocide Convention, is that one of the parties is alleging that that a genocide has occurred or is occurring. How might that impact the ICC's ability to move forward with a claim of genocide, given the fact that Ukraine seems to have sort of shuffled that to the side within this Genocide Convention hearing?
I don't think it'll have an impact at all. Obviously, Karim Khan has a separate mandate, a separate set of facts and law, and he will, in fact, make the appropriate decisions related to all international crimes, to include genocide. We have to be very, very careful. We throw around the word genocide all the time. We've been throwing it around with Israel and Hamas conflict, and it's a very precise international crime. It's a specific intent crime. You have to have the direct evidence to show that an individual directs somebody to destroy, whole or in part, a people's. And if you don't show that, that's not genocide. There is potentially incitement to genocide and potentially genocide related to that, but we would have to prove that Vladimir Putin intends to destroy in whole or in part, or incite individuals to destroy in whole or in part the Ukrainian people. And so that's a very high bar to prove. And so we throw that word around, and it and from a diplomatic and political point of view, it throws a lot of dust in the air and a lot of confusion by laymen who just they hear the G word and that's got to be it. But again, it also denigrates the victims because they're still dying of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there's no tiered approach to prosecution at the international level, having done that myself. We look at the facts and the law and we make appropriate decisions on that. And if it's not genocide, it's not genocide, or it may not be in your mandate. Like my mandate was, it was just war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we have to be very, very careful. And again, there's no tiered system. It's not genocide and crimes against and war crimes. I've even heard diplomats say, "Oh, it's just a war crime." Well, baloney, because frankly, 50,000 people who are killed based on some type of international crime, be it genocide, crimes against humanity, and/or war crimes, they're just as dead. Their families are just as ruined. So that we have to be very careful. But politicians and diplomats tend to do that. Also, when you do find that there may be genocide, then the Genocide Convention does kick in. And there is obligations by signatories to that convention to do something about that. And so there's a counterpart to this too. A lot of nations don't like to say the G word because then all of a sudden there are legal obligations under international law that require signatories to do something like that. And so it goes both ways. They throw the word around and makes it confusing, but then they also, if they say, their legal advisors are saying, well, if we find a genocide, then we may have an obligation as a signatory to do something about that. And, in most instances, they're not that interested in doing something about it. So, anyway, that's just a kind of a non-answer to a point. But I think it's important for our participants just to kind of understand that we got to be careful. And again, we've seen this in the Israeli-Hamas war too, the word genocide being thrown around, and we have to be careful about who does what to whom, because again, it causes a lot of confusion. The key is that international crimes are being committed, and accountability should be had both under domestic law and international law. But if we just say it's just a genocide, it packages it too precisely, and that's not how it works.
This question may be a little bit outside of your purview, but Ed asked a question as to, are there mechanisms available to remove the Russian Federation as a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
Boy, wouldn't that be nice? It's really been not contemplated, really. One can lose, the removal process. I don't think there really is a removal process precisely but you can lose one's charter, one's license to be a member. That could be, diplomatically pulled. But, there's really, it's one of those things where the whole idea of an inclusive United Nations was just that. and that is inclusion, not exclusion. And again, we have this amazing challenge as a founding member of the United Nations, one of the four, the other being the United States, Great Britain, and France, then the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation. They're ingrained into the UN Security Council, and because of that, as a permanent member, and I mean, let me stress the word permanent. They ain't going anywhere. So I appreciate the point, but I don't see Russia being expelled from the United Nations, because if you easily do that, or do it in a way that you do that, then all of a sudden we got to start thinking about North Korea. We got to start thinking about Iran. All of a sudden we have a lot of bad guys outside the tent, as opposed to keeping them in the tent and trying to work it that way. And so if you think of it that way, then it's probably an easier way to understand why we want to keep everybody in the tent and not have the bad guys. So we're already seeing an excess of evil that's been created, very similar to what was in the 1930s. Iran, China, and the Russian Federation kind of operating out of the UN Charter in their approach to foreign relations and diplomacy, and working with their neighbors as fellow member states, settling disputes peacefully. They're looking, and particularly Iran and the Russian Federation, they are actively involved in aggression as we speak. And so just so much outside. But the fact that Iran and the Russian Federation are still members of the United Nations, I think it's better from a diplomatic, practical, and political point of view to keep them in the tent.
Great, thank you. A reminder, we have a few moments left, so if there are any questions from our audience, please put them in the Q&A. We have touched on one of the other questions, which is talking about some of the political realities with continuing support to Ukraine. So as you mentioned, I believe the United States funding mandate runs out at the end of this month. I think it's at the end of December. So that's a real time crunch. My understanding is that Germany is also in some budgetary discussions that are a little bit fraught and tense. And that the EU is also, I think it was the EU, that Viktor Orban in Hungary was putting up some challenges with funding, potentially as leverage to get funding for Budapest and some other cities in his country as well. So this is a multilateral challenge. As you mentioned, the United States is the greatest funder, but we are certainly by no means the only funder.
Well, this goes to the distraction, political distraction. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of right-wing oriented individuals who are presidents of members of NATO as well as the European Union. You got Orban in Hungary, you've got Erdogan in Turkey, and then all of a sudden, surprise, in the very back door of the core of the European Union, the Netherlands apparently just elected someone who has a very narrow view of the world, and that is going to play out. And that's also a potential real problem as well. The world is tending to be nationalistic and looking inward, not internationally, as we've gotten used to it. And so again, this is why we have to move forward, because this time next year, all of those distractions, those political distractions, are going to play out. The U.S. has a national election in 2024. The results of that is going to shape the world, because again, we don't know where that's going. But if the wrong decision is made, then the support to Ukraine will unravel very, very quickly, and Putin will continue his aggressive acts in and around the region. Iran will be emboldened. China will go, well, why not Taiwan? North Korea will say, my goodness, let's go ahead south. You can see where all this is going very, very quickly, and we don't want to see that.
I am mindful of a conversation we had with our summer interns this year, that the general feeling of optimism or pessimism as to countries' abilities to work together seems to be pretty reliant on when you became politically conscious. So for me, my intro point was perestroika, and that sort of great collaboration amongst nations to break down barriers and for democracy to expand and flourish. for our interns, it's really been in the last 8 or so years, and that's been a very different world that they have entered into. And so I find myself very optimistic about our ability to continue to work together, and our summer interns not nearly as optimistic.
I started my political awareness of the world of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I've been literally fighting Soviets and Russians all my adult life. And it's always the Russians. It's always the Russians since 1945, and it continues to this day. Again, Russia is Russia is a beautiful country. It has an amazing culture, but it also has it does not have a democratic tradition. They've been ruled by strongmen for over 1,000 years, czars and strongmen and what have you, and quote presidents. But in reality, Russians are comfortable with strongmen, and that just flies in the face of the general trend of in the 21st century, late 20th and beginning of the 21st century, where nations are more democratic oriented. And so, yeah, it is always the Russians. And, I've been fighting the Russians literally and figuratively all my adult life. And once again, we're doing the very same thing, with the Russians.
There is a question from Michael. So there has been a general sense that Westphalian principles work, that they respect state sovereignty. But when countries abuse the privilege by indoctrinating their citizens through state-run media and fear, or attack other acknowledged sovereign countries, should Westphalian principles not be absolute? And if so, how would you recommend, with your knowledge of the imperfect nature of the ICC and the UN, to enforce those?
Wow, I could write a doctoral dissertation on that. Well done. My goodness gracious. Again, the whole idea of international law is law by consent. It's a very unique kind of approach to allowing countries to continue their sovereignty, but yet be part of a international family, which on a day-to-day basis requires associations to trade and finance and political relations, what have you. And so, Westphalia really anchored the beginning of a way by which nations can conduct affairs with one another. And over time, treaties, protocols, and norms developed to include customary international law, which allows, 190 nations to move about the world in any way they feel appropriate, as long as they follow, the rule of law. And so the real challenge is that we are now having countries question the Westphalian model, the UN paradigm of settling disputes peacefully, but also just the idea that we conduct our affairs with other countries under law versus under our own political scheme or needs. And so we've slipped a little bit in portions of the world, and we've been having that discussion, this afternoon. So again, we have to live in a real world. But again, if we conduct ourselves and enforce the concept of rule of law to include punishing and going after states that choose not to follow the rule of law, that's what we have to do. We have to do it under the rule of law. I just wrote an interesting op-ed 2 weeks ago on Iran, and I was basically raising the question is, we've been coddling Iran for too long. We've been using this, the really soft approach. We've used sanctions and those kind of things. But, sometimes the world has just to come together and go after a country to confront them under international norms, but confront them to force them into going back to the rule of law, and that includes the use of force. There is a legal way by which we can use force against a member state of the United Nations to restore international peace and security, which Iran is very much outside of now and sees no real challenge related to that, because the UN, because of the lack of, the UN Security Council, just like during the Cold War, really doesn't have any assertive power anymore. UN has been wobbling. It's not a, some of it's more socially oriented family of organizations like the World Food Program, World Health Organization. They've been doing well, but the political respect of the United Nations has really declined over the past several years, and is really a non-entity when it comes to really forcing nations to follow the rule of law. So it goes on other nations. Such as the European Union, NATO, what have you, they have the capability of having the threat enough to let tyrants know that if they walk away from the rule of law, they'll be held accountable. And so this is why it's such a critical time. 2023, 2024 will be the 1938, 39, 30 moments in history. And we know what the result of that was. It was a global war. We don't want to go there again because potentially that's the end state, and we don't want to do that. So again, this is why it's so critical.
You have given me consideration for another webinar, so thank you very much. A question from Donna: does it make sense to expand NATO or a similar organization into more than just a defensive organization? Is to what you were just describing with UN, are there other international organizations that could perhaps pick up some of that slack?
A good question, Donna. There are regional organizations that have some have quite a bit of clout, like European Union, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But there is the Southeast Atlantic Treaty Organization. There's the OAS Organization of American States. It ebbs and flows, but there are other regional organizations that do have the capacity to continue the use of rule of law and to settling disputes peacefully and stuff. So it's not just the United Nations, but the lack of political respect and practical respect of the ability of the United Nations to settle disputes peacefully has really been damaged. And we're seeing the result of that as well. People feel comfortable with spreading their wings in a very negative way and engulfing member states. So, the UN was designed for international peace and security and to face down, and in some ways by force, member states who choose to step outside of that. And Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, even China are starting to move away from that. And some of it is just, they're just not concerned about the ramifications of what they're doing. And that's going to be we're into some potentially very unsettling times, to be sure.
Okay, so for our final question, I will take this one from Peggy, and it reminds me of an earlier conversation you and I had, I think shortly after the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine, about the age of the strong men and how sometimes these invasions are ways to distract their own internal people from political realities, from their own suffering. And so Peggy asks, do you see today's news of the Venezuelan invasion of Guyana as an example of the opportunity for authoritarian aggression to distract their own citizens who oppose them?
Peggy, you really nailed it on the head. Dictators, thugs who control absolutely have to have an outside threat in order to stay in power. They have to show their constituents that, but for me, whatever is threatening them from an external point of view, you will be challenged by that. I call it, kind of known for this phrase, the boogeyman concept. They've got to have a boogeyman. Iran has the great Satan. Who is that? The United States, to rally the people against. North Korea does that a lot. Soviet Union is already, the Soviet Union, Russian Federation does it, et cetera. Tyrants have to have an outside threat to stay in power. And so they're always looking for that, particularly when their political power begins to wane. I'm sure Putin began to realize that he was in some political challenges. Nothing wrong with invading somebody to rally the people. And so, this aggression contemplated by Venezuela of going after another member state is indicative of the lack of respect to the United Nations concept of settling disputes peacefully. But yeah, this allows the president of Venezuela an ability to, quote, rally his people from a political point of view to face down the boogeyman that is Guyana. But what he's really doing, he's going after the oil, et cetera. And so any outside distraction to keep the people away from their own repression is a good thing for the dictators. It comes right out of the dictator playbook. I don't know if there is a playbook, but I've been studying, prosecuting, and going against heads of state for well over 2 decades, and I know them, I get it, and that's what they're doing. This is just something out of it's a classic movement by a dictator to consolidate and increase political authority and power by going after a perceived boogeyman. And that could be for right or wrong reasons. I mean, most of the time, the boogeyman is fictitious and or made up.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Appreciate your comments and your questions. David, as always, thank you for your insights and your vast wealth of knowledge. I appreciate that you take the time to have these conversations with us. As you know, these webinars are always some of our best subscribed to. So we know that there is thirst and hunger for this information, and I appreciate your willingness to provide it.
My pleasure, and it's always good to be with you personally, as a friend, but also with really this important center called the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. It's a real gem and a center of really great learning. And so my compliments for holding these types of events.
Thank you. And for our audience, keep an eye out for future programs. Wish you the best of the holidays coming up. Hanukkah starting later this week and Christmas in a few weeks. And thank you. We look forward to bringing you more programs in 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you.